All right, so this is the first video in the next area of knowledge that we're going to cover for TOK class here at ISSR. This is our fourth area of knowledge. Hopefully you remember we did the natural sciences, moved on to art, and we covered ethics. So we're moving on to religion. And we've got a few things to talk about when it comes to religion. And it's an interesting one. It's a controversial AOK, not only amongst students, not only amongst staff, but also in the wider TOK community. When uh, religion was announced as being one of the areas of knowledge with this syllabus, there was a bit of controversy kickback. Um, and the reason that I like to teach religion as one of our optional AOKs for theory of knowledge class is that is just because of this, because of the controversial nature. I don't think that um, religion is something that we should shy away from discussing, because I think that a lot of action is committed in our world, and ideologies are based on religious ideologies, pretexts, the nature of religion, the nature of faith. So I think for us to not talk about religion as an area of knowledge is to do ourselves a disservice, and not to completely explore the ways in which we know things, the ways in which we classify knowledge. Going through this unit, we're going to talk a little bit about how religion fits into theory of knowledge in our introduction, and the ways of knowing that relate to it. We're going to talk then about the nature of God from a monotheistic perspective. Um, we're going to consider the arguments from religious experience for knowing things from a faith based perspective. We're going to talk about intelligent design and the arguments that are given for that, cosmological arguments, the issue of that suffering presents for us as knowers and as people of faith and not of faith. We're going to talk about two ways of knowing that we most often perceive as being at odds, that of reason versus faith. And then we'll cover a little bit of the varieties of different religions, because I think one of the mistakes that we make all the time is assuming that religion, or putting ourselves in a sort of Eurocentric bubble, and assuming that when we're going to talk about religion, we're going to talk about the Abrahamic religions, and that's it. But those are only a handful of the many, many religions that exist all over the world. So most of our time as human beings, at first glance, is spent towards fulfilling our basic needs. Um, those of you that know it, we've got the hierarchy of needs: food, sleep. These things tend to be integral to our existence. But once we've satisfied those things, excuse me, um, then we start focusing on what the purpose of our lives are, why we're here, and what the meaning of our existence and our actions is leading to. And we tend to naturally come to questions that are unanswerable, like what is the meaning of life? And is death the end of the human experience? And why do we have suffering in the world? Human beings are a type of animal, but we don't tend to see religion per se in other animals that exist on Earth. It's something that is unique to human beings. Just like in the last unit, we talked a lot about uh, ethics being something that tends to be unique to human beings. Um, Many people tend to look to religion because religions can and do provide answers to these questions. And another reason that we consider religion as being on the same level and just as important as other areas of knowledge, like the natural sciences, like history, like ethics, like the arts, like mathematics, is because they exist and permeate in all cultures and at all times. It's very difficult to find a culture that has not had some sort of connection to religion, to spirituality, to some sort of faith based way of knowing. Where we start running into issues, and or we start thinking and unraveling religion, is the fact that religions don't give the same answers to these important questions, like what's the meaning of life and what happens after death. So within religious knowledge systems as an area of knowledge, we have conflicting reports. So that's something that we're going to focus on. And there are people who do not belong to specific religious communities who aren't satisfied with any of the answers that religions provide. So whether you consider yourself as a member of a religion or outside of a organized religion or outside of any sort of spirituality, um, we're all faced with these questions, and we're all faced with the fact that answers don't line up and that satisfaction with these answers might not be full. Lots of cultures have organized their understandings of the world, their ideologies, even their ethics around religious beliefs. So our exploration of AOKs and the WOKs is ultimately going to be incomplete without looking at religion. So I talked a little bit about that at the beginning. Um, I think what's tricky for you guys as students in Sweden is that we live in a fairly atheist country. We don't tend a lot of put of, excuse me, we don't tend to put a lot of effort into understanding religious ideology or religious history. So one of the things that I will warn you as TOK students is that we have had students in the past who have decided to use religion as an AOK for the presentation or for their written assignment, um, and have not presented um, top quality work because their background knowledge of religion in the first place is rather limited. And that leads me to my sort of next point is that I'm not here to teach you religion. Um, you're not supposed to learn about all the different various religions and their tenets and their ideologies and how they work from theory of knowledge. We are, again, a meta course. We're exploring how people use faith to know things, um, be that from an insider or an outsider perspective. So if you choose to use religion for one of your assessments, make sure that you are well versed in that religion before making blanket statements or generalizations about the inner functions of those specific religions. Thomas Jefferson said, "Question with boldness even the existence of God, because if there be one, he must more approve of homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." So this is where I'm going to ask you to stop the video for just a moment and open up your, well, I guess this will be a new uh, journal section in Google Classroom. And I want you to respond to Thomas Jefferson's quote here. So pause the video, respond in writing to it, and then come back. So we're throwing some IB terminology up on the board. Every one of us, are or are expected to be, frankly, global citizens. So we have an obligation to discuss our deepest convictions in an objective and dispassionate way to better understand our own beliefs and how they relate to those from different cultures and backgrounds. Every single one of you in this classroom comes from a different family. You have different cultural backgrounds. And one of the things that we need to establish from the beginning of this is that we need to respect other people's beliefs to a certain extent. Because one of the things that we talked about at the beginning of TOK class is we want to avoid simply accepting cultural differences. That's not what I'm advocating that you do. I am advocating that you have enough of an open mind to listen to your classmates, especially to those who have um, perhaps beliefs or ideologies that don't line up with your own as a means of learning about the way that those people know things. Not necessarily as being open minded to convert to a religion or to go from being a believer to being an atheist, but instead to appreciate and understand how we justify our beliefs from a religious or, frankly, non religious perspective. So, if this were a real class, what I'd ask you to do is talk about how science, the arts, history, and ethics can be affected by people within those communities having or not having religious beliefs. So, if you want to add this to your journals, you're welcome to, but that's not a requirement for this course. So we need to introduce a little bit of vocabulary and make some distinctions about religion before we can dive right in. So there are first three sort of topics or ideas that I want you to understand, and that's theism, pantheism, and atheism, because we're going to be using this terminology quite a bit. So theism, first of all, is the idea that the universe is governed by an singular, eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving creator. This would be God. So you can think of like the Abrahamic religions. Pantheism, on the other hand, is different from theism, is that in that God is everything and everything is a part of God. So reality is spiritual in nature, and the everyday world that we consider to be our realities is an illusion. So God permeates in a way with pantheism that a monotheistic God does not. And our third idea is atheism. So most of you are probably familiar with what atheism is, and that is, in a way, the opposite of the first two beliefs. It's the denial of the existence of a creator God. It's the belief that the universe is material in nature, as in it has an existence, and it is not spiritual in nature at all. So we can look at some major religions in the world and see them reflected in these three things. There's some fun Greek roots there at the bottom for you as well. Oh, there's more. You don't have to be one of these sort of things. And the reason that I saved this one and gave it its own slide and want you to think about this one is that agnosticism is a skeptical position that doesn't assert, nor does it deny the existence of God or some higher reality, but it keeps an open mind about these questions and these ideas. And what I'm going to suggest you might be reticent to accept, but is that each of you as TK students should take on the role of that of as an agnostic. Um, Even if you don't consider yourself to be one, or you consider yourself to be a theist, pantheist, or atheist, I think it's very healthy for you to put yourself in the mindset of being an agnostic. Um, we joke all the time about one of the IB learner profile traits being open-mindedness, but this is really a chance for you, I think, to be open-minded, to be willing to learn about and accept new and different ideas. Well, not necessarily accept, but at least interact with new ideas, and to be skeptical, but not too skeptical. Okay, so one of the first things we're going to talk about is the nature of God. So we need to talk from a linguistic point of view about what it means when someone says to someone else, I believe in God, or I do not believe in God. It's a tricky thing because God is associated with the divine. So, in trying to describe God using nature, which is using language, which is inherently fallible, it contains errors, it is limited in its capacity to transfer knowledge. There's a danger that we then reduce God to being something less than God, or to create um, paradoxes that cannot be solved. One of the things that I think is interesting about Islamic art is that you're not allowed to picture, say, for example, Mohammed. And I think this sort of helps us maybe as more Western people to understand why that might be, in that a human creation can never reach the level of the divine. It can never truly depict God in a faithful and true way. Therefore, it is not even attempted. So for us to speak about the nature of God and to consider God, we have to then also consider our limitations as mortal beings. Excuse me. Um, One of the most typical ways, especially in Western society, to think about God is to speak of God as being a father or as a creator, and to think of the love of a divine creator as being similar to that of human love. You can see in the picture on the right, I've put a typical picture of what people tend to automatically think of God as being. We like to anthropomorphize God into a human form. Um, Long white beard, sage-like face with all kinds of omnipotence and omnipresence. Um, I think what's interesting is if you go back through history, um, we see gods depicted as human beings, and that should give us pause for a minute. Um, all the way back to the Greeks, they realized this that we would put a human face on the divine. And I think I'm gonna butcher this name, I'm sure. Xenophanes said, "But if cattle and horses or lions had hands, or were able to draw with their hands and do the work that men do, horses would draw the forms of the gods like horses, and cattle like cattle, and they would make their bodies such as they each had themselves." So we think of God as looking, sounding, being human. Not necessarily because God is, but because that helps us to wrap our heads around the idea of the divine. We can see it in classic art as well from the Renaissance. This is Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. It's on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And again, it's reinforcing this idea of God as an old man with a long white beard, same as Santa Claus, right? So going back to the idea of language, um, when you refer to God as the Father, you're making an analogy between God and that of human beings being father and their children. And analogies break down, and analogies are not perfect examples or comparisons. Uh, I myself am a father, and it's not really fair to liken my relationship with my children to that of God to the human beings that inhabit God's universe, right? Um, so one could argue that all religious language needs to be based on analogy in order for us to exist, or for it to work. So if a person says God exists, um, the use of that word is not used in its normal sense. So it's not fair if you take the two sentences at the bottom of the screen to compare them and to say that they work in the same way. Because if someone says to you, pickles exist, your response, whatever it might be, is not going to be the same as the statement, God exists. And that's not necessarily the fault of language, but it's the fault of our perception of how language works. It's also, if you think about reason for a moment, one is verifiable and one is not. And that presents a real challenge for a lot of people because we have to go somewhere else. So I'm going to leave you at the end of this first video with a few. I've written them as discussion questions, but I'd like you to do them as questions for your journals. Do you think of God as a he or of a she or as an it? And what is the difference in using those different words when thinking about God? If someone in the room thinks of God as a she, is your perception of the divine somehow different? And do you think God exists or is supposed to exist as a thing or as a force? Or is there some way that I haven't come up with that God might exist? So the video is going to end here, but go into Google Classroom, open up your uh, journals, and take a moment to reflect on these ideas.